All right, so you sent us a whole bunch of articles from Al Jazeera,
Oh, wow.
all dated February 20th, 2025. Seems like you're trying to figure out what's going on around the world, but especially in the U.S.,
Yeah.
under a second Trump administration.
Wow. Okay, so this isn't just like a routine of his first term, though.
Right.
We've got the Ukraine war still going on. Musk is getting more and more powerful.
Uh-huh.
And it seems like things are really starting to change in politics and the economy.
Yeah, looking at these articles, some big themes definitely pop out.
Okay.
Like, obviously, U.S. politics is a huge one, with Trump stirring things up as usual.
Right.
But there's also some pretty crazy stuff happening internationally, especially with, like, Ukraine and Russia.
Uh-huh.
And then there are these big economic shifts, too.
Yeah.
I mean, canceled government agencies, Venezuelan people being deported to Guantanamo Bay. It's definitely not a normal week.
And it's not just the events themselves, it's how they're all connected.
Right.
Like the U.S. wanting this rare earth mineral deal with Ukraine at the same time they're kind of pulling away politically.
Okay.
That has a huge impact on both countries and on, like, the whole balance of power in the world.
It's like a giant game of chess with some really big risks.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so let's start with U.S. politics.
All right.
We've got Kash Patel confirmed as the new AI director,
Uh-huh.
which seems to be making some people nervous.
Yeah, the vote is really close.
Hmm.
And what's interesting is that even some Republicans, like Murkowski and Collins, voted against him.
Oh, wow.
Patel's past statements about, like, going after journalists and political opponents,
Right.
well, it's made a lot of people concerned about what this means for the FBI's independence.
Yeah, that whole deep state museum idea he talked about.
Yeah.
I mean, seriously, what's he trying to say with that?
Well, I think it's feeding into this idea that the government is basically corrupt and can't be trusted. You know, it's a really powerful message, especially for people who are already feeling kind of disillusioned with politics.
Right?
But it could also undermine people's faith in the institutions that are supposed to be upholding the law.
It's like he's trying to make any criticism of him seem like it's coming from this shady deep state.
Exactly.
So he can avoid any investigations into what he's doing.
And that has implications beyond just Trump himself.
Right.
It creates an environment where facts and evidence don't matter as much as ideology and belief.
Okay, so we've got a potentially partisan FBI director.
Yeah.
And then there's Linda McMahon being nominated for education secretary. Which is kind of confusing because Trump said he wanted to get rid of the whole Department of Education.
It's definitely ironic.
Right.
And it makes you wonder what Trump is really planning. Is he actually trying to change education, or does he just want to get rid of a department that he doesn't agree with?
And what about McMahon herself? I mean, she comes from the world of professional wrestling.
Yeah.
Which doesn't exactly make you think education expert.
Well, she did run the Small Business Administration under Trump during his first term.
Okay.
So she's got some government experience.
Right.
But it's her views on diversity programs and things like curriculum restrictions that are worrying people.
Because those are issues that go beyond just education policy.
Exactly.
They touch on fundamental questions of equality and social justice.
And it all connects to this bigger trend we're seeing with Trump's second term, shrinking the federal government and giving more power to the president.
Which reminds me of that Washington Post Ipsos poll.
Oh, yeah.
Showing that 57% of Americans think Trump's already doing too much on his own.
Wow, that's a lot.
That's a pretty clear sign that people are uncomfortable with this power shift.
It is, and it shows that people are feeling uneasy about where the country is headed. The poll also shows that people see Trump's actions very differently. For example, a lot of his supporters really like his deportation campaign.
Okay.
But even some of them are worried about how close he is to Musk.
So it's not just about Trump himself.
Right.
It's about the people he surrounds himself with.
Yeah.
And the influence they have.
Exactly.
Speaking of questionable use of power, let's move on to New York City Mayor Eric Adams.
Oh, yeah.
And that whole corruption scandal.
The Justice Department deciding to drop the charges against him right before he met with Trump at Mar-a-Lago. That was pretty suspicious.
Right.
And then 4 of his deputy mayors quit because of it.
Wow.
That definitely doesn't make you feel like everything was above board.
It just looks like there were some shady deals happening behind closed doors.
Yeah.
And now a court in Manhattan is deciding whether to actually drop the charges. So this whole thing could go on for a while.
It's a messy situation, and it shows how power politics and justice all get mixed up in the U.S.
Okay, so we've got political drama happening on both the federal and local levels. But things are even more intense internationally.
Right.
Especially with the war in Ukraine still going on.
Yeah.
And it seems like Trump's taking a completely different approach this time around.
Yeah, his recent attacks on Zelensky were pretty shocking. Calling him a dictator and blaming him for starting the war. That's a huge change from the U.S.'s previous support for Ukraine against Russia.
It's almost like he's trying to rewrite history.
Yeah.
Or at least his version of it.
Right.
And what's up with him canceling that press conference after Zelensky met with Trump's envoy Keith Kellogg? If the meeting was so productive, like they said, why all their secrecy?
Well, it probably has something to do with Zelensky not being invited to those U.S.-Russia talks in Saudi Arabia. That's a pretty clear sign that the U.S. is changing its priorities.
Okay.
And maybe even who it supports.
And then there's the economic side of things.
Yeah.
The U.S. really wants that rare earth mineral deal with Ukraine, which seems like a good move strategically, but
it makes you wonder about the U.S.'s real motive.
Right.
Are they really trying to help Ukraine, or are they just taking advantage of a bad situation to benefit themselves?
Especially considering how pushy they're being about it.
Right.
Trump's national security advisor, Mike Waltz, even called Zelensky's criticisms of Trump insults.
It's a tricky situation.
Yeah.
It shows how complicated international relations can be. On one hand, the U.S. wants to stop relying on China for rare earth minerals,
Which are super important for a lot of high-tech industries.
Exactly.
But on the other hand, they risk alienating an important ally in the process.
Yeah.
So the U.S. is pushing Ukraine away at the same time that they're trying to get something valuable from them. And then on the other side, we have Russia hinting at maybe wanting better relations with the U.S.
After that meeting in Saudi Arabia, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said he'd be open to getting rid of some of the economic barriers between the two countries.
Which is pretty surprising considering all the sanctions and the back-and-forth threats we've been hearing.
Yeah, it's unexpected.
It's like they're playing good cop, bad cop with Ukraine stuck in the middle. Is this a real change in the relationship between the U.S. and Russia?
Right.
Or is it just a tactic?
It's hard to say for sure, but it's definitely something to keep an eye on.
Okay.
And it's not just about the U.S. and Russia either.
Right.
Other countries like France are getting involved, trying to influence what happens. French President Macron is planning to meet with Trump next week. And he's made it clear that he wants to take a strong stance against Putin.
So it's a really complicated situation with lots of moving parts.
Yeah.
We've got changing alliances, economic pressures, and a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen next.
Right.
But let's bring it back to the U.S. for a minute.
Okay.
And talk about what's happening with the IRS.
The IRS layoffs.
Yeah.
It seems like Trump's still determined to make the federal government smaller, even if it means cutting essential services.
And a federal judge just said that those layoffs can continue, even though labor unions are trying to stop them through lawsuits. This seems to be part of a bigger pattern, right?
Yeah.
We saw it with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the CFPB. It practically got dismantled.
Absolutely.
And it's not just about spending less money.
Right.
It's about having less government oversight and regulation, which can have some pretty big consequences for regular people. Right? We're talking about job losses, weaker consumer protections, and maybe a less stable financial system overall.
And we can't forget about Elon Musk when we talk about the CFPB.
Right.
He's been a big critic of these agencies. It seems like he had a hand in its downfall.
Musk's influence on Trump's second term is definitely noticeable.
Yeah.
Some people see him as a brilliant entrepreneur, but others are worried about his conflicts of interest.
Right.
Especially with his plans to turn X into a financial hub, going around Congress to get rid of a regulatory agency.
Yeah.
That sets a dangerous precedent.
It's like we're seeing power shift not just from the government to corporations, but from traditional institutions to these big tech companies who are making their own rules.
And speaking of power dynamics and how they affect real people, let's talk about those Venezuelan deportees being held at Guantanamo Bay.
That's a really disturbing development.
It is.
It raises serious questions about human rights and due process.
Right.
The fact that the Trump administration is saying they can deny these people legal counsel because of limited due process rights is really troubling, especially when you consider that a lot of them are being held based on weak accusations of criminal activity.
It's part of this bigger crackdown on immigration that we've seen under Trump, which has led to the revocation of temporary protected status, or TPS, for hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans.
Wow.
The National TPS Alliance is actually suing the government over this. They're saying it's motivated by racial bias. They argue that revoking TPS is illegal because it assumes these people are in the country illegally.
Okay.
Which isn't always true.
It's a reminder that politics isn't just some abstract game played by powerful people.
Right.
It has very real consequences for people's lives. And in this case, those consequences are devastating. Yeah, it really makes you think, you know, behind all the news headlines and political speeches, there are actual people whose lives are being turned upside down.
Right.
And it's not just happening in the U.S. either. It's all over the world. Take the situation in Gaza, for instance.
Right. The ceasefire doesn't seem to be going very well.
Yeah. Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, said that Israel wanting Hamas out of the government is a big problem for getting that second phase of the ceasefire going.
Okay.
It's this demand that goes back to the whole Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which has been going on for decades.
And then you've got Trump making things worse with his idea to take over Gaza.
Right.
And as you might expect, the Palestinians said absolutely not.
Whether he's serious or not, it really shows how he likes to make these big pronouncements and shake things up, even if it might make an already bad situation even worse.
Yeah, we've seen that happen over and over.
Right.
With Ukraine, with his policies here in the U.S.,
Mm.
even with how he deals with other world leaders.
It seems like he likes chaos.
Yeah.
Some people might see that as being strong and decisive,
Right.
but others see it as reckless and dangerous, especially when you think about what could happen because of it.
We can't forget that these political decisions have real effects on the world.
Exactly.
Like those IRS layoffs we talked about.
Uh-huh.
And getting rid of the CFPB.
Right. Those aren't just policy changes on paper. They're going to have a ripple effect through the whole U.S. economy.
Exactly. We're talking about people losing their jobs,
Yeah.
families having trouble making ends meet,
Hmm.
and a higher risk of financial problems for everyone.
And on a global level, those changing alliances and the chance of conflict between big countries,
Right.
that creates uncertainty and anxiety that everyone feels.
It's like the ground is always moving under our feet.
Yeah, and it can feel overwhelming, like you have no control over anything.
Right.
But I think it's important to remember that we as individuals can still make a difference. We can make choices, we can take action, and we can influence things, even in small ways.
You know, going through these articles, I noticed that they're not just reporting on events.
Right.
They're telling stories about people who are caught up in these global changes, like those Venezuelan deportees or the IRS workers losing their jobs.
It makes the news more personal.
Right.
It reminds us that these aren't just abstract political issues.
Exactly.
They're having a huge impact on people's lives.
Okay, before we finish up, there's one more thing I want to go back to.
Okay.
You mentioned it earlier, and it really stayed with me. Kash Patel and his idea for a deep state museum.
Oh, yeah, that's a creepy thought, isn't it?
It is. I mean, it sounds kind of funny at first.
Right.
But when you think about what it means, it's actually pretty disturbing.
It's a way of saying that any criticism or disagreement is coming from this secret group of enemies. It's something that dictators have done throughout history to silence their opponents and make themselves more powerful.
And the fact that he's in charge of the FBI now,
Yeah.
that's what really worries me. The FBI has so much power.
Hmm.
And if it's used for political reasons, it could really hurt our democracy. It's like something out of a scary book.
It reminds us that we can't just assume our democratic institutions will always be there.
Right.
We have to pay attention, we have to hold our leaders responsible, and we have to protect the ideas of freedom and justice that make our society work.
So we've covered a lot in this deep dive.
We have.
We've looked at politics in the U.S., the changing relationships between countries, and the economic and social changes happening everywhere. It's complicated and kind of unsettling.
It is, but even with all this change, there are still some signs of hope.
Okay.
We see people coming together demanding change. We see more awareness of how global issues are connected.
Right.
And we see people recognizing that we need to work together to solve them.
It's easy to feel powerless when faced with such big problems.
Yeah.
But as we've seen in these articles, individuals can make a difference.
Absolutely.
Whether it's speaking out against injustice-supporting groups, working for good, or just having conversations with friends and family about these things.
Right.
We all have a part to play.
And in the end, it's those individual actions multiplied by millions of people that will shape what our future looks like.
Like we've been saying this whole time, the world's a pretty complicated place.
Yeah.
And it seems like it's only getting more complicated.
It really does.
But we can't just give up and say it's too much to handle.
Exactly. The more complex things get, the more important it is to understand what's happening.
Right.
And not just because it's interesting to know.
Right.
But because it affects the decisions we make and the actions we take.
Okay.
And ultimately, the kind of future we end up with.
So let's think about you, the listener, for a minute.
Okay.
We've gone through all this stuff about U.S. politics, international power struggles, economic worries.
Right. A lot to take in.
What are the big takeaways here?
Well, one thing that really stands out is how often actions have consequences that nobody expected.
Like what?
Well, for example, Trump's moves on Ukraine were probably meant to weaken Russia, but they might actually end up bringing Russia and the U.S. closer together.
Really?
At least when it comes to the economy.
It's like setting off a chain reaction.
Yeah.
One thing leads to another and then another.
Exactly.
And you don't always know where it's all going to end up.
And we see this happening in the U.S. too. Like making government agencies smaller might sound good to some people.
Less bureaucracy?
Right. And it also means less oversight, less protection for consumers and workers. Those Venezuelan deportees at Guantanamo, that's a direct result of policies that were probably supposed to make immigration harder.
Right.
But they ended up violating people's basic rights.
It makes you realize that we need to really think about the policies being put in place.
Yeah, both in the U.S. and around the world.
We need to ask, what are the goals, but also what are the potential unintended consequences?
Exactly.
Who benefits and who gets hurt?
And that brings us back to the idea of individual agency.
Okay.
We might feel small when we see these big global shifts,
Right.
but our choices really do matter.
Staying informed is important,
Yeah, for sure.
but it's not enough. We need to actually do something.
We need to talk about these things, hold our leaders accountable.
Because in the end, it's what we all do together
All of us as individuals.
that will decide what the future looks like.
Think of it this way. Those articles you took us, they paint a picture of a world that's changing.
Okay.
But it's not a finished painting. It's still being made, and we all have a part in how it turns out.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, here's our challenge to you. Don't just read the news and forget about it.
Right.
Talk to people, share what you've learned, let it influence the choices you make in your own life.
Because even small actions, when a lot of people do them, can create a really powerful force for change.
Thanks for joining us on this journey through the news and beyond. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep pushing for the world you want to see.